She looked like the rain had been trying to wash her away and had very nearly succeeded. That was Tobin Hark's first thought when he saw her sitting on the bench at the end of the Harrow Creek platform, tucked against the wall where the overhang gave about 2 feet of shelter from the downpour and not an inch more. She was sitting very still, the way people sit when they have stopped expecting anything to change, but have not yet decided what to do about it. The rain had been falling since before dawn. Not the quick, hot summer rain that blows through Wyoming territory and leaves the grass steaming in the sun, but the slow, gray October kind that settles in like a tenant and makes it clear it has no intention of leaving. It turned the single road through Harrow Creek into a river of red mud. It had emptied the street of every living thing, except the horses tied under the livery awning and one underfed rooster standing on the porch of the general store with the offended dignity of a creature who believes the weather is a personal insult. And it had soaked the woman on the platform down to what appeared to be her last dry thought. Tobin had come to the station for a delivery of feed grain that he could barely afford and could not afford to miss. Hoplan. The evening train from Cheyenne was late, which in 1881 meant it could be late by an hour or late by a day, and the station master, a man named Polk, who had held the job for 11 years and had developed the philosophical patience of someone who has learned that arguing with a railroad schedule is like arguing with weather, had simply shrugged and gone back inside to his stove and his coffee, leaving Tobin on the platform with his collar turned up and his hat pulled low and nothing to do but wait. That was when he saw her. She was young, maybe 23, maybe less. Though the exhaustion on her face made the kind of precise accounting difficult that people attempt when they first look at a stranger and try to sort them into a category. Her hair was dark and had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in when the day started, plastered now against her neck and the collar of a coat that was too thin for the season by at least a month. Her boots were worn through at the toe of the left one, and she had wrapped something around it, a piece of cloth or a rag tied tight with what looked like kitchen string. She had one bag beside her on the bench. Not a trunk, not a case, just a canvas bag with a drawstring top, dark with rain, holding whatever she had left in the world that was worth carrying. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they were shaking. Not dramatically, not the wild trembling of someone in real medical danger, but the slow, persistent shiver of a body that has been cold for a long time and has quietly given up on the idea of being warm again any time soon. She was not crying. She was not looking around for help. She was staring at the tracks where the train would come from if it came at all, and there was an expression on her face that Tobin recognized, though it took him a moment to name it. It was the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere and is not sure it matters. He had seen that look before. He had worn it himself 2 years ago, standing in the same station with $16 in his pocket and a deed to 40 acres of land that everyone in Harrow Creek had told him was not worth the paper it was printed on. He knew what that look cost, and he knew it was not the kind of thing you put on your face. By choice, the rain came harder. The woman pulled her coat tighter, which did nothing, and Tobin Hark stood 12 feet away under the overhang and did what most people in Harrow Creek would have done, which was nothing. She was not his concern. He had his own concerns, and they were considerable, and getting involved with a stranger on a train platform in the rain was the kind of decision that sounded generous in the telling and turned expensive in the living. He knew that. He knew it well, and he walked over anyway. Tobin Hark was not a poor man in the way that invites pity. He was poor in the way that invites nothing at all, because the kind of poverty that comes from working every day and still falling short does not look dramatic enough for anyone to notice. He was 31 years old. He had been in Harrow Creek for just over 2 years, having come west from a played-out farm in eastern Nebraska, where his family had spent 3 generations, slowly losing the argument with the soil. His father had died, owing money to men who did not grieve him. His mother had followed 7 months later, not from any illness the doctor could name, but from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes when the person you have been holding things together for is no longer there to hold them for. Tobin had buried them both, sold what little remained for enough to clear the debts and leave him with almost nothing, and taken a train west because west was the direction people went when staying put was no longer a viable theory. He had ended up in Harrow Creek the way most people ended up in small Wyoming towns in those years. The train stopped, the land was cheap, and someone at the general store told him there was acreage available south of town that nobody wanted because the previous owner had failed on it, and the owner before that had failed on it, and the general consensus was that the land itself was the problem. Stubborn and rocky and cut through with a creek that flooded in spring and dried to a trickle by August, Tobin had bought it anyway. 40 acres at a price that should have told him everything he needed to know. He had a small house on it now, 2 rooms that he had built himself from timber he had cut and hauled alone. He had a barn that leaned slightly to the east in a fashion he chose to describe as character rather than structural failure. He had 9 horses, down from 12 after a hard summer, and a reputation in town as a man who was honest and hard-working and probably not going to make it. That last part was never said to his face, which is how he knew it was the truest thing people believed about him. The ranch was called Craven Rock, named for the flat stone outcrop on the north end of the property, where the creek bent around a shelf of granite that looked in certain light like the prow of a ship pointed at the horizon. End quote. Tobin had liked that when he first saw it. 2 years later, the metaphor had soured somewhat. The horses were good stock, but there were not enough of them to turn a profit. The hay cost more than he could recover in sales. The fence line needed work that required 2 men, and he was 1 man. And the bank in Cheyenne that held the note on his land had sent a letter in September that was polite in the way that letters from banks are polite, when they are delivering a deadline, all softened language and courteous phrasing wrapped around a very hard truth. He had until spring. If the note was not current by April, the land would go to auction. And Tobin Hark, who had come west to stop being the last in a line of men who lost their land, would become exactly that. He did not talk about this. Not to Polk at the station, not to Virgil Dunn who ran the general store, not to any of the men he occasionally worked beside when someone in town needed an extra hand for a day or 2. He kept it in the place where men like Tobin kept such things, behind his teeth and below his ribs, where it sat like a stone he had swallowed and could not pass. So when he walked across the platform toward the woman in the rain, he was not doing it from a position of abundance. He was not a man with room in his life for someone else's trouble. He was a man 12 feet from his own disaster, walking toward a stranger because something in him, some stubborn remainder of the way his mother had raised him, would not let him stand still while another person shivered. He did not know that this was the most important walk of his life. But it was. He stopped 3 feet from the bench, close enough to be heard over the rain, far enough to not crowd a woman sitting alone on a platform in a town she did not know. "Ma'am," he took off his hat, realized that was a poor decision in a downpour, and put it back on.
"Tree!"
"You waiting on the train." She looked up at him. Her eyes were gray or green or something between the two that the low light in the rain made difficult to fix. They were steady. Tired, but not vacant. The eyes of someone who was paying close attention to everything, despite looking like she had stopped caring about any of it. "I was on the train," she said. "It let me off here." Tobin waited. That was half an answer, and he could feel the other half sitting behind it. "I was headed to Rawlins," she said after a moment. "I had a position arranged, housekeeper for a family there." She paused. "The letter I received said to arrive by October 1st. I am 4 days late. I expect the position is filled." She said it without self-pity, without appeal, the way you state a fact that you have already absorbed and are no longer hoping to change. "Do you know anyone in Harrow Creek?" Tobin asked. "No." "Do Do you have anywhere to go tonight? A pause. The rain filled it. No. Tobin looked at the platform, at the mud, at the sky, that showed no sign of relenting. He thought about the $16 and the train, and the deed to land nobody wanted. He thought about his mother, who had once let a stranger sleep in their barn in Nebraska during a blizzard, and had said afterward that the cost of a kindness is almost always less than the cost of the guilt you carry when you don't offer one. "There's a boarding house on the main street," he said. "Fenella Gratch runs it. She's fair. I could walk you there." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I have 40 cents. It was not a plea. It was an inventory. She was telling him what she had, so that he would not waste his time offering her something she could not afford. "I'll speak to Fenella," Tobin said. "She'll work something out. I do not take charity." It is not charity. Fenella always needs help. She has 12 rooms and 2 hands. You would be doing her a service. That was not entirely true. It was not entirely false either, but it was what he had. The woman studied him. He could feel her reading him the way a person reads a situation when they have learned that trusting the wrong person costs more than sleeping in the rain. Whatever she saw, she seemed to arrive at a conclusion. "My name is Maren Solveig," she said. She stood up from the bench, and Tobin noticed 2 things at once. The first was that she was taller than he had expected, nearly his height, with a kind of frame that suggested she had once been stronger than she currently appeared. The second was that as she stood, she glanced past him toward the far end of the street, where the road bent south toward the open country, and her eyes moved across the landscape with a quality of attention that did not match anything else about her appearance. It was fast and practiced. She looked at the muddy road, at the state of the fences visible at the edge of town, at the horses under the livery awning, at the angle of the rain and the direction the wind was pushing it. It was the look of someone who knew how to read land and weather, and who did it automatically. A person who has spent years outdoors cannot stop themselves from reading the sky, just as a person who has spent years reading books cannot enter a room without scanning the shelves. Tobin saw it. He did not know what to make of it, but he filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things that did not yet have an explanation, but might matter later. "Tobin Hark," he said. "My ranch is south of town." Maren Solveig picked up her canvas bag. It was heavy for its size, heavier than clothes alone would account for. She held it with both hands, close to her body, the way a person holds something that contains more than its appearance suggests. "Thank you, Mr. Hark," she said. "I will remember this." He did not know then how literally she meant it. They walked together through the rain toward the main street of Harrow Creek, and behind them the rain fell on the empty bench and washed away the only evidence that anything had changed at all, which is usually how the most important things begin. 3 days later, Maren Solveig walked out to the Craven Rock Ranch. Tobin did not know she was coming. He was in the barn working on a bridle that had cracked at the cheek piece and needed restitching when he heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to see her standing at the open barn door with the October light behind her. She looked different than she had at the station. Fenella Gratch had apparently found her clothes that fit, or close enough, and she had pulled her hair back and tied it with a piece of cord, and the shivering was gone, replaced by something quieter and harder to read. She stood in the doorway and looked at his barn the way she had looked at the landscape from the platform, quickly, completely, missing nothing. "Fenella told me your place was south of town," she said. "I hope you do not mind." "I don't mind." He set the bridle down. "How are you getting on at the boarding house?" "She is letting me stay for work. I clean the rooms and cook breakfast. It is a fair arrangement." She paused. "She also talks a great deal, which I am learning to navigate." A brief flicker crossed her face, close to a smile, but not quite willing to commit. It did not stay long. She stepped into the barn. Her eyes moved across the stalls. across the tack hanging on the wall, across the tools and the feed bins and the condition of every surface. Watched her do it and felt a strange discomfort, the kind that comes when someone sees the inside of your life without being invited to look. "You have 9 horses," she said. "I do. The bay in the second stall has not been shod recently. He is favoring his left front, and the gray mare at the end is thin in a way that is not about feed. She has worms, or she has an abscess somewhere you have not found yet." Tobin was quiet. Both of those things were true. He had noticed the bay's gait 2 days ago, and had not yet had time to address it. The mare he had been worried about for a week. "Where did you learn horses?" he asked. "Sell. My father raised them. Draft horses in the Bitterroot Valley in Montana. I grew up in the barn before I grew up in the house." Tobin put his hands on the work table. He could feel where this was going, and he needed to stop it before it arrived. "Miss Solvay, I appreciate you walking out here, and I appreciate what you did at the station, or rather what I did at the station, which was just walk you to Fenella's and which was not much. But I am not in a position to take on help. I am not asking for wages. It does not matter. I cannot feed another person. I can barely feed the 9 animals I have and myself in the order that keeps all of us standing. I eat very little. That is not the point. What is the point, Mr. Hark?" He looked at her. He thought about the last time he had accepted help from a stranger. A man named Durgin who had come through Harrow Creek in the spring and offered to work the fence line in exchange for a meal and a place to sleep for a week. Tobin had agreed. Durgin had stayed 4 days, done half the work he promised, drunk the bottle of whiskey Tobin kept for cold nights, and left between one evening and the next with a saddle and a halter, and the particular silence that fills a place when someone has taken something from it. Before Durgin there had been another man, a drifter who talked well and worked poorly, who had spooked 3 of Tobin's horses through a gate he had left open, and cost Tobin 2 days rounding them up, and one animal he never found. End quote. The word no was reasonable. The word no was earned, and it was sitting right there on his tongue, ready and justified and sensible, Miss Solvay. He began. The sound came from the south pasture. It cut through the barn and through the conversation and through the reasonable word forming in Tobin's mouth, and replaced all of it with something immediate and wrong. A horse screaming. Not the whinny of a restless animal or the complaint of a horse wanting feed. This was the high, ragged panic sound of a horse in genuine distress, the sound that moves through a horseman's body before it reaches his brain. Tobin was through the barn door before he finished his thought. The south pasture was visible from the rise behind the barn, and what he saw there stopped him mid-stride. The fence was down. Not the whole line, but a section near the creek bend where the posts had been soft since August, and he had been meaning to replace them and had not, because there were only so many hours and only so many hands, and something always came last. 3 of his horses were through the gap and moving fast toward the creek, which was running high and ugly from 3 days of rain, swollen past its banks and carrying the kind of current that can roll a horse if it steps wrong. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was the gray mare. She was down. Not running, not standing, down on her side near the broken fence with her legs moving in the terrible rhythmic way that means a horse is cast or tangled or hurt badly enough that its body has overridden its instinct to stand. Tobin started running toward the pasture. Behind him he heard Marin's footsteps, and he heard her voice, calm and carrying and utterly without panic. "The 3 by the creek, are they likely to cross? If they reach the bend, they will try. Then you go to the creek, turn them before the bend. I will handle the mare." He turned to say that she did not know the mare, that the mare was difficult on her best days and dangerous when she was frightened, that a stranger approaching a downed horse in pain was a good way to get a skull kicked in. But Marin Solvay was already moving, and she was not running. She was walking fast, but controlled, straight toward the fallen animal, and there was a certainty in her stride that made Tobin do something he almost never did. He trusted a stranger. He ran for the creek. The 3 horses at the creek were panicked but not yet committed. They were bunched at the water line, tossing their heads at the noise of the current, wanting to cross because the far side was open ground. And open ground meant safety, but not yet willing to step into water that was moving faster than their instincts said water should move. Tobin came down the slope talking, not shouting, not waving his arms, and just talking in the low, steady way that his father had taught him. He got between the horses and the water and pressed them gently, firmly, back up the slope. The buckskin gelding tested him once, tried to cut left toward the tree line, and Tobin sidestepped and blocked him, and the gelding gave up the argument. 7 minutes. He had all 3 back through the gap in the fence and into the north pasture where the fence still held. He closed the gate with the wire loop and stood there breathing hard with the rain in his face, and then he turned and looked toward where he had last seen the gray mare on the ground and where he expected to see the worst. He did not see the worst. Marin Solveig was kneeling beside the gray mare, and the gray mare was still on her side, but her legs had stopped their terrible cycling. She was still, not the stillness of death, the stillness of an animal that has been reached by something calmer than its own fear. Tobin walked down the slope. As he got closer, he could hear Marin's voice, low and continuous, not words exactly, or not words he could make out, more the kind of steady, tuneless sound that lives somewhere between speaking and singing, the sound his mother used to make to the chickens when she was gathering eggs, which was absurd, and had no business working on a 900-pound horse with a history of biting strangers. But it was working. The mare's head was on the ground, and Marin's hand was on the mare's neck, just behind the jaw, and the mare was breathing in the slow, deep rhythm of an animal that has decided to trust the person touching it. Marin looked up as Tobin reached her. "She's not tangled," Marin said. Her voice was the same as it had been in the barn. Calm, specific, unhurried. She went down on a soft patch near the post hole and cast herself against the fence rail. She has a gash on her right flank from the wire. It needs cleaning and closing, but it is not deep. And her left foreleg is strained, not broken. I have checked it. Tobin stood there. The rain fell. He realized his mouth was slightly open, and he closed it. The wire was rusted, Marin continued. So the wound will need to be washed with vinegar or carbolic if you have it, and packed, and watched for the next several days. She should be stalled, not pastured, until the leg is sound. I would say 10 days at minimum. She looked at the mare. Her hand had not stopped moving on the animal's neck. She will stand when she is ready. If you push her, she will panic again. I would give her another few minutes. Tobin looked at his horse. He looked at this woman kneeling in the mud and the rain beside an animal she had never met, with blood on her hands from a wound she had already assessed, and a diagnosis she had delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who has done this many times before. "How did you get near her?" he asked. "She does not let strangers near her. She bit the farrier in June. She bit me last month." Marin looked up at him. "Horses do not bite people they trust," she said. "They bite people who approach them like a problem. I did not approach her like a problem." Behind Marin, coming around the far side of the barn with the unhurried trot of an animal who has just completed his own investigation of the situation and arrived at his conclusions, came Tobin's dog. He was a merle-coated working dog of uncertain breed named Patchett, who had been with Tobin since the Nebraska days and who trusted exactly 3 people in the world, all of whom were Tobin. Patchett walked directly to Marin Solveig. He did not sniff her hand. He did not circle her. He walked to her side and sat down beside her in the mud and the rain and leaned his shoulder against her leg with the decisive weight of a dog who has made a judgment and does not intend to revisit it. Tobin stared at his dog. His dog did not look at him. The mare, after another 2 minutes, gathered herself and stood. She shook once, hard, and then she turned and pressed her muzzle against Marin's shoulder and held it there, breathing into the wet wool of her coat. Marin stood up. She wiped her hands on her skirt, which made no difference since everything was equally soaked, and she said, "Your south fence has been soft since before the rain. At least 4 posts need replacing and the wire is rusted through in 3 places beyond the break. Your north pasture fence is better, but it will not last the winter, and the barn roof on the east side is lifting at the eaves." She paused. "You have good horses, Mr. Hark. Better than your fences deserve." Tobin looked at the gray mare standing now, calm now, blood on her flank, and a stranger's handprint still visible on her neck. He looked at Patchett, who was gazing up at Marin with the devoted intensity of a dog who has found religion. He looked at the broken fence, the swollen creek, the barn with its leaning walls and its lifting roof. The whole struggling architecture of his life laid bare in the rain. The word no was still available to him. It was still reasonable. It was still the safe choice, the earned choice, the choice that every experience he had ever had was telling him to make. He did not make it. "I have carbolic in the barn," he said. "Help me with the mare. We will talk after." They treated the mare's wound together in the barn while the rain continued its long argument with the roof. Marin cleaned the gash with carbolic in steady hands while Tobin held the mare's head, which turned out to be unnecessary because the mare stood perfectly still from Marin, as though they had known each other for years rather than minutes. When it was done and the mare was stalled with fresh water and a blanket and the particular expression of an animal who has decided to be tolerant of her circumstances, Tobin leaned against the stall door and looked at Marin Solvay and said the only thing he could think to say. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask you to. I know. But I need to say it so we both understand what this is. I have 9 horses and 40 acres and a note with the bank that I am behind on. I have no money for wages. I barely have money for feed. If you work here, what I can offer you is meals when I have them, a roof that mostly keeps the rain out, and honest work that will not make either of us rich." Marin looked around the barn, at the stalls, at the tack wall, at the tools hung on nails, at the hay stored in the loft above, taking inventory, measuring the distance between what was and what could be. "Where would I stay?" she asked. Tobin had thought about this during the walk back from the creek, which had given him approximately 4 minutes to construct a plan for a situation he had not expected to be in. "There is a room at the back of the barn," he said. "I used it for storage, but it has a window and a floor, and I can put a cot in it by tonight. It is not much. I have been sleeping in Fenella Gratch's attic on a mattress that smells like 14 years of boarding house guests," Marin said. "Anything with a window is an improvement. Supper is whenever I get around to making it. I am not a good cook." "I am," Marin said. It was not a boast. It was the same tone she had used to describe the mare's wound, a fact delivered without decoration. "Then supper is your department," Tobin said, and an understanding settled between them in the barn. Not a contract, not a handshake, just the quiet agreement of 2 people who had nothing to spare and were choosing to pool it anyway. That evening, Marin cooked supper in Tobin's small kitchen, using what she found in his pantry, which was not much, and turned it into something that was more than not much. Tobin ate without speaking. Patchett lay at Marin's feet, with his chin on her boot, and the blissful surrender of a dog who has found his second person and intends to keep her. After supper, Marin washed the dishes without being asked. She dried them and put them back in the places she had found them. She said good night and walked to the barn. Tobin heard her close the door to the back room. He heard nothing else. No rummaging, no restlessness, no sounds that did not belong. He sat at his table with the bank's letter in front of him and Patchett at his feet, and the strange, unfamiliar sense that a single degree had shifted in the architecture of his days, too small to measure yet, but present all the same. He did not know yet what that shift would become, but Patchett, who was wiser than Tobin in the ways that mattered, already did. In the weeks that followed, Maren Solveig did not try to impress Tobin Hark. She simply worked. And the work spoke in a language that did not require translation. The first morning, Tobin saw the canvas bag open, on the cot in her room, and he understood why it had been so heavy. It held the farrier's rasp, a hoof pick, and nippers worn smooth at the handles, a folding knife, and a leather roll of stitching tools for tack repair. Her father's tools. She had carried them from Montana through 2 years of drifting because they were the one thing she would not leave behind, and within a week, every one of them had been put to use. She started with the fences. Not just the broken section in the south pasture, but the entire perimeter, every post, and every wire, on all 40 acres. She walked the line in the early mornings before the light was fully up, carrying pliers and a spool of wire and a leather pouch of staples, and she came back each evening, having replaced what needed replacing and reinforced what could hold a while longer, and she never once asked Tobin where to start or what to prioritize. She simply saw what was weakest and went there first. By the end of the second week, the fence line at Craven Rock was tighter than it had been since the day Tobin built it, and it had taken Maren half the time working alone that it would have taken Tobin working with help. He noticed. He did not say anything. She did not seem to need him to. The gray mare healed. Maren checked the wound twice daily, cleaned it, repacked it, and on the 10th day unwrapped it for the last time and ran her hand along the scar and said, "She will carry a mark, but she will carry it well. She is tougher than she pretends to be." She also found the abscess, a deep one, along the mare's gum line that had been suppressing her appetite for weeks. Maren lanced it, packed it with salt, and within days the mare was eating with the enthusiasm of an animal making up for lost time. The mare, who had previously communicated with Tobin primarily through biting and the occasional well-aimed kick, now followed Maren around the barn like a very large and slightly offended dog. Maren did not acknowledge this. The mare did not seem to mind. Then there was the matter of the creek. Tobin had spent 2 years cursing the creek that ran through Craven Rock. In the spring, it flooded and turned his south pasture into a swamp. By August, it dried to a trickle that barely watered the horses. It was the feature of the land that everyone in Harrow Creek pointed to when they explained why the property was doomed. The creek that giveth and the creek that taketh away, as Virgil Dunn at the general store liked to say, with the satisfied air of a man quoting scripture at someone else's misfortune. Maren studied the creek for 3 days before she said anything. She walked its length from where it entered the property at the north end to where it bent around the granite outcrop and continued south. She crouched at the banks and looked at the soil and the rock and the way the water moved over the shallows. She climbed the granite shelf at Craven Rock and stood there for a long time, looking down at the bend. On the 4th day, she came to Tobin while he was grooming the buckskin and said, "Your creek is not the problem. Your creek is the answer. You are just asking it the wrong question." Tobin stopped brushing. "I am asking it to water my horses through August. And it cannot do that, the way it runs now, because the bed is too wide at the bend, and it spreads shallow and evaporates. But the granite shelf acts as a natural dam point. If you build a small catch basin on the upstream side of the rock, even a basic one, stone and clay, nothing fancy, you could hold enough water through the dry months to feed 20 horses. Not 9, 20. Tobin stared at her. He had looked at that granite shelf 100 times. He had named his ranch after it, and he had never once seen what she had seen in 4 days. "My father did the same thing on our land in the Bitterroot," she said. "Different creek, same principle. Water does not care about your problems, but it will cooperate if you give it a reason. They built the catch basin together over the course of a week. Maren designed it. Tobin hauled the stone. It was hard work done in cold weather, with basic tools and no guarantee it would hold. But when they finished, and Tobin stood on the granite shelf and looked down at the pool forming behind the wall of fitted stone and packed clay, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time on this land. The feeling that something might actually work. There were other things, smaller things that accumulated the way snow accumulates, each one insignificant alone, together transforming the landscape. Maren reorganized the feed storage in the barn so that nothing was wasted to damp or mice. She identified a patch of wild timothy grass on the north slope that could be cut and dried for winter hay, saving Tobin the cost of buying it from town. She mended the tack that Tobin had been meaning to mend for months. She noticed that the buckskin gelding had a sore developing under his saddle pad and adjusted the padding before it became a problem that would have cost Tobin a week of lost work. She cooked every evening. Simple meals, nothing extravagant, but made with a competence that turned basic ingredients into something that felt like more than survival. Tobin found himself looking forward to supper in a way he had not done since Nebraska, since his mother's kitchen. They ate together at the small table in the kitchen. Patchett positioned himself exactly between their chairs with the diplomatic precision of a dog determined to show no favoritism despite having clearly chosen a favorite. The evenings were quiet. Maren was not a talker. She asked questions about the land, about the horses, about which pastures held their grass and which ones thinned out in dry years. The questions of someone building a map of a place from the inside out. Tobin answered, each evening. A little more, he found himself telling her things about the property he had not told anyone, not because they were secret, but because no one had asked. The way the light hit the south pasture in the late afternoon and turned the grass gold, how the wind came down off the mountains in January and found every crack in the house, the name of every horse, and the story of how each one had come to him. Maren listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually taking in what was said and fitting it into the map she was building. And Tobin, who had spent 2 years talking mostly to Patchett, realized one evening with a start that he was no longer lonely. It surprised him. Not because he had not known he was lonely before, but because he had not known it was the kind of thing that could change. But there was a quality about Maren Solveig that he could not settle, not a wrongness. He had a sense for dishonesty that had been sharpened by Durgin and by the drifter before Durgin, and by a lifetime of learning that people who seem too good to be true usually are, and Maren did not trigger that sense. She worked without being watched. She never went into the house uninvited. She handled his horses and his tools and his trust with a care that could not be performed for this long without being real. It was something else entirely. It was the way she never talked about Montana. She had mentioned the Bitterroot Valley once, on that first day. She had mentioned her father and his draft horses. And then she had closed that door and walked away from it. And every time the conversation drifted in that direction, she steered it gently, somewhere else, with the practiced ease of someone who has been avoiding a particular room in their own memory. 4 words she had given him. The Bitterroot Valley. Her father. Draft horses. And behind those 4 words, years of silence that had turned a rancher's daughter into a woman sitting alone on a train platform in the rain with 40 cents in a canvas bag. Tobin. Let it be. He did not push. He had his own rooms. He did not open for visitors. But he wondered. And the wondering kept him up at night longer than it should have, which told him something about himself that he was not quite ready to examine. The first real cold came in the 3rd week of November, the kind that turns the water in the basin to ice overnight and makes the morning a contest between the will and the body. Tobin had built a fire in the kitchen stove that was larger than usual because the wind was finding new routes through the walls, and because Maren had been coughing since the day before. A dry, tight sound that she dismissed, and he did not. He had made her a tea of boiled ginger and honey that afternoon, which she had accepted without comment, and the cough had loosened by evening, though he kept the fire high. They had finished supper. Patchett was asleep between them with the absolute commitment of a dog who has found the warmest place in the house and has no intention of yielding it. The fire moved in the stove. Outside, the wind was doing its January rehearsal, pushing hard at the windows and finding every gap Tobin had not yet sealed. Maren was mending a bridle. Her hands moved with the same steady economy they brought to everything she did. Tobin was sitting with the bank's letter in front of him, which he had taken to reading every evening the way a man reads a clock. "He cannot stop, Maren," he said. She looked up. "What happened in Montana?" She did not flinch. She did not deflect. She set the bridle down in her lap and looked at the stove for a long moment, and Tobin could see her deciding whether to open the door she had kept closed since September. The stove ticked and settled in the silence. Patchett shifted in his sleep. The wind pressed at the glass. "My father's name was Arne Solveig," she said. "He was Norwegian. He came to Montana in 1862 with nothing but a talent for horses and a stubbornness that the territory could not cure." She paused. "He built a ranch in the Bitterroot Valley, 60 acres. Draft horses, Percherons mostly, some Clydesdales. He bred them and trained them and sold them to logging operations and freight companies and anyone who needed an animal that could pull its own weight and someone else's." She looked at her hands. "My mother was a schoolteacher from Missoula. She married my father because he was kind and because he made her laugh, and because she said he was the only man she had ever met who treated a horse better than he treated himself, which she considered a recommendation, a breath. She died when I was 11. Fever. The winter kind that comes fast and does not negotiate. Tobin was very still. After that, it was just us, my father and me. I learned everything from him. The horses, the land, the fences, the water, all of it. I was not his son. He never said that mattered, and I believed him because he was a man who said only things he meant." She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone walking across ground that might not hold. "He got sick in the spring of 1879. It was slow. He could not work the way he needed to. I tried to do it alone, but 60 acres and 14 horses is not a job for one person, especially a person that the men in town did not take seriously, because she was 19 and female and had no legal standing to negotiate a contract without a man's name beside hers." She looked at Tobin. "A man named Cresser owned the land adjoining ours. He had wanted our water rights for years. He waited until my father was too sick to fight him, and then he filed a claim with the county that our eastern boundary was surveyed wrong. It was not surveyed wrong. My father had done it himself, and he did not make mistakes of that kind. But Cresser had a lawyer and money and friends in the county office, and I had a dying father, and no proof that would satisfy men who had already decided what they wanted to believe." Her voice did not break. It thinned, like a wire, under too much weight, not snapping, just stretching toward its limit. "We lost 20 acres, the 20 that held the best pasture, and the creek access without the water. The horses could not stay. Without the horses, the ranch could not function. I sold what I could. I paid what I owed. My father died in August. The room was very quiet. I buried him beside my mother on the hill above the barn. And then I closed the door and walked away with what I could carry." She picked up the bridle again. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not. "I have been moving since, working where I could find it. The position in Rawlins was the first real offer I had in 6 months. And I was 4 days late because the train from Helena was delayed by a washout on the line, and because the world does not organize itself around the schedules of women with no resources and no standing." She pulled a stitch through the leather. I sat on that platform in Harrow Creek because I had nowhere else to sit, and a man I did not know walked over to me in the rain and did not ask me what I had done to deserve being there. He just asked me if I had somewhere to go. She looked at Tobin. Nobody had asked me that in 2 years. Tobin was quiet for a long time. Patchett, sensing a gravity in the room that was above his understanding, but within his instinct to respond to, woke up and put his head on Marin's foot. "You lost your father's land," Tobin said finally, "because someone with more power decided to take it." "Yes." He looked at the bank's letter on the table. "I am about to lose mine," he said, "because I do not have enough to make the note current by April." It was the first time he had said it out loud to anyone. The words sat in the kitchen between them, heavy and real and no longer his. Alone, Marin looked at the letter. She looked at Tobin. "How much?" she asked. He told her. She was quiet, calculating behind her eyes. "The catch basin will hold," she said. "By spring you can water 20 horses. Not 9, if you can acquire stock through the winter. Even 3 or 4 more head. The operation changes. The math changes. Acquiring stock costs money I do not have." "Not always," Marin said. "There are horses that people give away because they cannot handle them. Horses that are written off as broken or difficult or not worth the feed. I have a talent for those horses." She looked at the stove. "My father used to say that a difficult horse is just a horse that has not yet met the right person. I never fully believed him until I watched that gray mare of yours press her nose into my shoulder." Tobin looked at her across the table, across the bank's letter, across the distance between two people who have each lost something that cannot be replaced and have found themselves improbably in the same small kitchen, on the same cold night in the same struggling corner of Wyoming territory. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, not unkindly. "Just needing to know." "Because I watched someone take my father's land while I stood there with no way to stop it," Marin said. "And I will not watch it happen again. Not if I can help." Garrick Suttner came to Craven Rock on a Tuesday morning in early December, riding a black horse that was worth more than Tobin's entire operation, and bringing with him 2 men who sat their saddles with the loose, unhurried ease of people who are accustomed to making their presence felt without saying much. Tobin knew Suttner. Everyone in Harrow Creek knew Suttner. He owned 1,100 acres north and east of town, and an unknown number of business arrangements that seemed to expand every season. He was not a cattleman by origin, but a speculator from Denver who had come to the valley 5 years ago with capital and patience, and who had already bought 3 ranches in the county by waiting for hard winters and hard years to do the convincing for him. Tobin was at the barn when he saw them coming up the road. His stomach did something cold and familiar. He set down the halter he was holding and walked to the fence. Marin was in the north pasture, working with a roach-maned mustang she had acquired 2 weeks earlier from a freighter who had been about to shoot it for biting. The mustang was now standing quietly, while Marin ran her hands along its neck. She saw the riders and went still. Suttner stopped his horse at the gate. He did not dismount. Men like Suttner rarely dismounted when visiting men like Tobin. The height difference was the point. "Hark," Suttner said. He had a deep voice and a beard trimmed close, and the kind of face that appeared friendly from a distance and became something else up close. "I have been meaning to come out, Mr. Suttner. I heard you've been making improvements. Fence work. Something at the creek." He looked past Tobin toward the catch basin, which was visible from the road, now the stone wall, neat and solid above the waterline. "Ambitious." "Practical," Tobin said. "I also heard you have someone helping you." "A woman." He said the word with a small smile that contained more information than the word itself. "Working your stock. I have a partner." "A partner." Suttner repeated the word as though he found it amusing but chose not to laugh. "Hark, I'll be direct. I know about your note at the bank. I know the amount and I know the date. That is not a secret in a town this size." Tobin said nothing. "This land has beaten 2 men before you. The creek is unreliable. The acreage is too small for a real horse operation, and you are one hard winter away from losing everything you've put into it. He leaned forward in his saddle. I am offering you a clean exit, fair price enough to clear your note and leave you with something in your pocket. The land is not for sale. Everything is for sale, Hark. It is only ever a question of timing. Then your timing is poor. Suttner's expression did not change, but a hardness gathered behind it, the way the sky tightens before weather turns. He looked past Tobin again, toward the barn, toward the pasture, toward the figure of Marin standing in the field with a horse that had been unrideable a month ago and was now standing at her shoulder like a pet. "Who is she?" Suttner asked. "I told you. My partner. She have a name. She has a name that is none of your concern." One of the flanking riders shifted in his saddle, a small movement practiced, designed to draw attention to the weight on his hip. Tobin felt the cold thing in his stomach tighten. And then Marin was there. She had crossed the pasture and come through the gate without Tobin hearing her, which was something she did, moved through spaces without disturbing them, the way she moved through a herd of horses, without the herd knowing she had moved. She stopped beside Tobin at the fence. Patchett appeared from somewhere and pressed against her leg, staring up at Suttner's horse with the focused attention of a dog who has identified a threat and is waiting for instructions. "My name is Marin Solvay," she said. "I manage the stock and the land operations at Craven Rock. If you have business with this ranch, you may state it." Suttner looked at her. His smile came back, the one that was friendly from a distance. "Ma'am, this is a conversation between men about a business matter." "This is a conversation about my home," Marin said, "and I will be part of it." The word home landed in the space between them and stayed there. Tobin glanced at Marin. It was the first time she had used that word about Craven Rock. She did not look at him. Her eyes were on Suttner, steady, unhurried, holding the same quality of calm she brought to everything, not performance but presence, the particular stillness of a person who has decided where they stand and is not available for relocation. "Mr. Suttner," she said, "you have made an offer. The offer has been declined. That is the end of this visit. Miss Solvay, I don't think you understand the financial realities. I understand them precisely. I also understand that this property now holds a functioning water catch system that changes the carrying capacity of the land. I understand that the stock here has increased by 4 head in the past month with plans for more by spring. And I understand that the value of this operation is moving in a direction that will not benefit your offer. So if your strategy is to wait for Mr. Hart to fail, I would suggest you revise it." Silence. The wind came off the mountains and pushed at the grass. Suttner looked at Marin for a long time. Then he looked at Tobin. Then he looked at the catch basin, at the repaired fences, at the horses in the pasture, at the barn with its new shingles, at the whole quietly transformed landscape of a place he had expected to find dying, and instead found alive. "This conversation is not over," he said. "It is for today," Marin said. "Good morning, Mr. Suttner." Suttner turned his horse. The 2 riders followed. They went down the road at a walk, which was deliberate, the pace of men who want you to know they are leaving because they choose to, not because they were asked. Marin stood at the fence until the sound of hooves faded. Then she turned. Tobin was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not surprise exactly. A recognition, quiet and full, as though he were seeing clearly a thing he had only sensed until now. "You called it home," he said. Marin looked at him. Then she looked away, at the pasture, at the horses, at the mountains holding their snow against the gray December sky. "I suppose I did," she said that evening. Tobin did something he had not done since Nebraska. He took down the bottle of rye whiskey that lived at the back of the shelf behind the flour tin, the one he had brought from his mother's house, and had never opened because it had been his father's, and opening it felt like spending the last of something he could not replace. He poured 2 glasses. He set one in front of Maren. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You stood at that fence," he said, "and you did not give an inch. There was no inch to give. I know." He turned his glass. "I have been trying to hold this place together for 2 years on my own, and I have been losing. And today I watched you walk up to a man who has taken 3 ranches in this county and tell him to revise his strategy, and you meant it, and he knew you meant it." He paused. "That is not something I know how to repay." Maren picked up her glass. "You repaid it in September," she said, "when you walked across a platform in the rain." They drank. Patchett, positioned between them with perfect diplomatic geometry, sighed the deep sigh of a dog who is exactly where he belongs. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Tobin had never made much of it since leaving Nebraska, and Maren did not seem to expect it. But on Christmas morning, Tobin came out to the barn and found that Maren had hung a sprig of pine from the doorframe and had brushed every horse in the barn until their coats shone, and the gray mare had a piece of red cloth braided into her mane, and Patchett was wearing a collar made from the same red cloth, and the whole barn smelled like pine and leather and intention. He did not say anything about it. Maren did not either. Some things do not require language. They just require noticing. January was brutal. 3 weeks of cold that turned the world to iron and made every morning a negotiation between what the body could tolerate and what the ranch demanded. The catch basin held, the fences held. The horses. Now 13 head after Maren had acquired 4 more animals that nobody else wanted, and had turned each one from a liability into an animal that moved and responded and worked as though it had been waiting its entire life for someone to ask it properly. The horses held. Maren worked through it without complaint. Tobin worked beside her. Somewhere in the deep cold of the 3rd week, when the mornings were so bitter that breath froze in the air and the walk from the house to the barn felt like a crossing rather than a commute, the last distance between them closed. Not in any dramatic way. There was no moment, no declaration, no scene. There was just the slow recognition built over months of shared work and shared meals and shared silence, that the 2 of them had become something that neither of them had expected, and neither of them was willing to name yet, but both of them understood. Tobin noticed it on a morning when he came out to the barn and heard Maren talking to the gray mare in the low, steady voice she used with the horses, and he realized that the hearing of it was the best part of his day. Maren noticed it on an evening when Tobin laughed at something she said at supper, a real laugh, the kind that comes from a place that has been closed for a long time and opens without permission, and she realized that the success of it mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with the ranch. They did not speak about it, not yet. There were things to settle first. In February, Tobin sat down at the kitchen table with his ledger, and Maren sat across from him, and they went through the numbers together for the first time. Tobin had been doing this alone since he arrived, the solitary arithmetic of a man counting down to a deadline, and sharing it felt like unclenching a fist he had not known was closed. The numbers had changed. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but materially. The catch basin had reduced his water costs to nothing. The hay from the north slope had cut his feed bill by 1/3. The 4 new horses Maren had rehabilitated were worth real money now, and there were buyers in Cheyenne who would pay properly for a well-started animal. "If we sell 3 head in March, at the prices Virgil thinks we can get," Maren said, "and if the remaining stock holds through spring, you can make the note." Tobin looked at the numbers. He looked at Maren. He said. Maren paused. "You said you can make the note. It has not been me since October. It has been we." She was quiet. The fire moved in the stove. Patchett, who had developed an unerring instinct for moments of emotional significance, put his chin on the table between them and looked from one to the other with the expression of a dog who has been waiting for the humans to catch up to what he figured out in September. "I have been thinking," Tobin said. "Since December, Since the fence. Since before the fence, if I am honest. Since the day you knelt beside that mare in the rain and she let you touch her. He put his hands flat on the table. I want to make you an offer. Not wages, not a working arrangement, a partnership. Legal blank, recorded with the county. 50% of the operation. Your name beside mine on the deed. Marin stared at him. 50%, she repeated. Equal. You have earned more than equal, but equal is what I can offer and what I think is right. Ah, Tobin, I came here with 40 cents in a canvas bag, and since then you have rebuilt my fences, fixed my water, healed my horses, driven off a man who has taken 3 ranches in this county, and given me a reason to believe that this place might actually work. He paused. That is not 40 cents worth of contribution. She looked at the table. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the numbers that told a story of a place that had been dying and was now improbably quietly coming alive. My father lost his land, she said, because a man with a lawyer took it from him, and I could not stop it, I know. And you want to put my name on your land. I want to put your name on our land. Marin's eyes were bright. She did not look away. She did not try to hide it. She let it be what it was. In the same way that a person who has been honest about everything else is honest about this too. I will earn it, she said. You already have, Tobin said. That is why I am asking. Marin reached across the table. She put her hand on top of his. It was the first time they had touched outside of passing a tool or steadying a horse. Her hand was rough and calloused and warm. Then, yes, she said. Patchett, sensing that the matter was finally resolved, thumped his tail against the floor 3 times and went to sleep. The papers were drawn up in March by a lawyer in Cheyenne that Virgil Dunn knew and vouched for. Marin, Solvay, and Tobin Hark, equal partners in the Craven Rock Horse Ranch, 40 acres, registered with the county. Suttner came one more time. He came in March with his lawyer and a revised offer and the patient confidence of a man who has always gotten what he waited for. He found Marin at the gate and Tobin at the barn, and Patchett stationed at the fence line with the unblinking resolve of a very small animal who has taken a very large oath. Marin said, Craven Rock is not for sale. Ridger. We are registered as a partnership with the county. Any future inquiries should be directed to our attorney, whose address I will provide. Suttner looked at Tobin. Tobin looked back at him with a hand on the fence post and the quiet certainty of a man who is no longer alone. Suttner left. He did not come back. The 3 horses sold in March for more than Virgil had predicted. Marin had trained them so well that the buyer from Cheyenne, a freight company foreman named Hadlow, who had been buying horses for 20 years, asked where they had come from, and when Tobin told him they had been acquired as cast-offs and rehabilitated, Hadlow looked at Marin with the expression of a man who has just been told that the water he has been drinking is actually something considerably finer. You have more like these? He asked. I will by summer, Marin said. Hadlow left a standing order, 3 horses per quarter, trained to the standard he had just witnessed, at a price that made Tobin sit down on a hay bale and stare at the figures he had just written in his ledger. The bank note was paid in full on the first day of April. Tobin walked into the bank in Cheyenne and set the money on the counter, and the clerk looked at the amount and looked at Tobin and said, Mr. Hark, I will be honest, we did not expect to see this. No, Tobin said. I do not imagine you did. He walked out of the bank and stood on the street in the spring sunlight and breathed air that tasted different than it had that morning. Though it was the same air. Some things change not because the world changes, but because you are finally standing in it without the weight of what was about to happen. Spring came to Craven Rock the way spring comes to places that have survived a hard winter. Slowly at first, a softening at the edges, the creek running free, the first grass showing green in the south pasture, and then, all at once, as though the land had been holding its breath and finally let it go. Marin planted a kitchen garden behind the house, without asking or being asked, and by May, there were beans and squash and the beginnings of something that looked like order in a place that had known mostly improvisation. The horses numbered 17 by June. Marin continued acquiring cast-off animals through the spring, finding them at auctions and freight yards and from ranchers who had given up on them, and each one arrived at Craven Rock difficult and left it transformed. Word had gotten around, not through newspapers, but through one person telling another at the general store that they had seen something worth mentioning. The word was that Craven Rock had good horses, that the woman out there could take an animal nobody else wanted and turn it into something that worked, really worked, in a way that felt less like training and more like translation. People came to see, ranchers from neighboring counties. A cavalry officer from Fort Laramie who bought 2 horses and wrote a letter to his commanding officer. A woman from Casper who drove 40 miles to ask Marin's advice about a stallion who had gone sour, and who came back a month later with a gift of honey and the news that the stallion was a different animal. The town of Harrow Creek, which had spent 2 years quietly expecting Tobin Hark to fail, adjusted its expectations with the grudging admiration that small towns reserve for people who prove them wrong without making a fuss about it. Virgil Dunn stopped saying the creek was the problem and started saying he had always thought the land had potential. Fenella Gratch, who believed she deserved partial credit for the entire arrangement, on the grounds that she had housed Marin for those first 3 days, told a version of the story at every opportunity in which she had personally arranged the introduction. A detail that bore no resemblance to anything that had actually happened, but which everyone accepted, because arguing with Fenella was widely understood to be a poor use of one's remaining years on Earth. On the first warm evening of June, Marin climbed the granite shelf at the north end of the property, the flat rock outcrop where the creek bent, and the catch basin held its water, and the land looked like the prow of a ship pointed at the horizon. Tobin climbed up beside her. Patchett, who was not built for climbing, but who was not built for being left behind either, scrambled up after them with the determined gracelessness of a dog whose loyalty exceeds his physical capabilities. They sat in the long light. Below them the horses grazed in the south pasture. The creek ran steady. The fences stood straight. The barn, which had once leaned east in a way that Tobin had called character, now stood plumb, because Marin had quietly leveled the foundation one afternoon without telling him until it was done. "I wrote to the county office in the Bitterroot," Marin said. Tobin looked at her. "I asked about my father's land. What became of it after Cresser took the water rights?" She was quiet for a moment. "It failed. He could not make it work either. The land went back to the county 2 years ago. It is sitting there, unowned, returning to what it was before anyone tried to make it something. Are you thinking of going back?" She looked at the valley below them, at the horses, at the fences, at the catch basin holding its water against the granite, at Patchett, who was leaning against her leg with his eyes closed in the absolute contentment of a dog who has run out of things to worry about. "No," she said. "I am thinking that my father would be glad to know I found somewhere." Tobin was quiet. Then he said, "I have been meaning to say something." Marin looked at him. "Not about the ranch. About the rest of it." She waited. The light was long and gold on the grass, and the creek caught it and threw it back in pieces. "I walked across a platform in the rain because my mother raised me to do that," Tobin said. "But I asked you to stay because you made this place into something I could not make it alone. And I am asking you something else now, because the ranch is not the only thing you saved." Marin looked at him. The evening moved around them, unhurried, patient, the way evenings move in places that have learned to hold still. "I know," she said. "I have been waiting for you to say it. How long?" "Since the gray mare. Let me touch her, and your dog sat down beside me in the mud, and you looked at both of them like they had betrayed you." Tobin laughed. "The real kind. "They knew before I did," he said. "Animals usually do." He took her hand on top of the warm granite. Below them, Patchett opened one eye, confirmed that things were proceeding as he had arranged, and closed it again. Years later, when the Craven Rock Horse Ranch had grown to 120 acres and the name was known in 3 territories, when Hadlow's freight company had a standing contract and cavalry officers came from 2 states away, when there were children in the house and dogs in the yard and horses in every pasture. The people of Harrow Creek told the story. They told it at Virgil Dunn's store and at Fenella Gratch's boarding house and at the church social and at the rail station where it had all begun. They told it the way small towns tell stories, with details added and details lost and the truth somewhere in the middle, durable and simple and real. A cowboy walked across a platform in the rain. A woman with nothing was sitting there shivering. He did not walk past. That was the whole story. Everything else grew from that. You do not always know the moment when a life changes direction. Sometimes it looks like a grand decision, a dramatic turning point, and a fork in the road with signs pointing both ways. But more often, it looks like rain, and a bench, and the choice to walk 12 feet instead of standing still. Most people stood still. Tobin Hark did not, and the whole town remembered.